Hi, this is Channel Propaganda Talks, where we talk about Russian propaganda, its origins, and nature. And this time, we're going to talk about one of the darkest parts of the Russian contemporary history, the Eight Days' War, or the war in Georgia. This was not the first war for Putin. If you know, he used the war in Chechnya that happened even before he became a president as one of his election promises and a part of his election campaign. But it was the first time for Putin to go outside of Russia and try to alienate some other country's territory and expand Russia. So this war is very important for the contemporary war in Ukraine and to understand how Russia became what it is. Before I start, I'd like to say thanks to everybody who donates to this channel and everybody who watches it, puts comments on under it, and puts likes. It helps to promote this channel, promote the videos, and helps me to keep making them. As you know, I send half of every money that I get from this channel to Ukrainian refugees organizations, and I invite you to do the same. Please send money if you want to send money and you can afford it. Please send it to Ukrainians or any other refugees that you would like to help to. Those people actually need money, and if you don't want to do this and for some reason you want to support me, here are the ways on how to do this. But again, please prioritize people who actually need this, and I will send half to them if you send it to me. Okay, so let's start. Let's remember 2008. 2008, the world was completely different. Before pandemic, before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, everything was absolutely different. Barack Obama was just elected a president. He was the first African-American president, and everybody had very high hopes on his office. At the same time, the crisis of 2008 that affected the big part of the world economy, the huge recession that happened after. The Beijing Olympics, all of the controversies around it and all of the problems related to it, which still went okay. And of course, unfortunately, the war in Georgia. Unlike with the other topics, I'm not going to give you the whole overview of the war and then go to the discourse. This time, I'm going to focus directly on the discourse and tell you how it corresponds to reality, if it has any confirmation or not. I hope you like this new format. I'm trying to save your time with this, so please comment on what you think about it. Let's go. One of the most common tropes used by the Russian state-owned propaganda is genocide and ethnic conflict. You can see that Russia goes a lot for the ethnic conflict. We looked how the USSR used Ukrainian and Belarus nationalities to take some Polish territories. And we can see nowadays how Russia is declining the very existence of Ukrainian nation as it is just to get some part of Ukraine. And although Georgia is very different from Russia, they are not Slavs, their language is pretty different, they were not an exception. Just like in 1939 in Poland and today in Ukraine, Russian propaganda through its state-owned media and officials claims that Georgia had a very strong ethnic conflict that led to genocide and ethnic cleansing. So let's talk about this first. Was there really conflict and was there genocide? Was there really a conflict? Unfortunately, yes, there was and there is. Like many other ethnic conflicts, the roots of this one are very deep. Those three nations coexisted together for centuries, and each of them has very rich and old culture. So you can imagine that they have very long traced problems. The current conflict is usually traced back to the Soviet era. When after the war in 1921, when Georgia became a part of the Soviet Union, Ossetia was divided into two parts: Northern Ossetia that became a part of the Russian Socialist Republic, and South Ossetia that became a part of Georgian Republic. Abkhazia was also a part of Georgian Republic. Both of those regions had some autonomy, which they didn't want to lose after the Soviet Union fell apart. That led to the wars after the Soviet Union fell. From 1991 to 1992, Georgia had a war with Abkhazia, and in 1992 with Ossetia. Those wars didn't solve the conflicts. The republics became de facto independent, but their self-proclaimed independence was not accepted by any other country, so their documents were basically not working anywhere. Also, those wars led to the fact that since 1992, Russian peacekeepers, and in fact the army, were the part and very present on the territory of Georgia, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Was there genocide? Russia and many other countries use this word quite often, so let's check whether there was genocide or not. There was a lot of research done about the war in 2008, and none organizations found any evidence of Georgian-led genocide. For example, you can check the reports from Human Rights Watch and Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. They didn't find any evidence of genocide at all, despite finding a lot of disproportionate actions. For example, Georgia used Grad machines when attacked Skin Valley. Those machines, they actually can't aim so well. And whenever you use them, a lot of harm will be done to many buildings around. So it's usually very bad to use in the cities. And Skin Valley is the capital of Ossetia, so it was a very big crime to use that. At the same time, there is evidence of ethnic cleansing done by the Ossetian side towards Georgian ethnic population who lived in Ossetia by the beginning of the conflict. This ethnic cleansing was done in the form of displacement of thousands of people from one place to another. Ethnically Georgian population of Ossetia, 197,000 people had to flee their houses, and most of them had to flee to the Georgia-controlled territory. Overall, the majority of Russians believe that Georgians were killing civilians, and I myself learned about the crimes done by the Russian army embarrassingly late. The white population does not know what happened there. They didn't know that the Russian army actually killed Georgian civilians. They don't know about the ethnic cleansing of Georgians. So for many people, they have some sort of consensus around this war. It probably helps Russians to feel better. But this idea goes very well into this narrative of Russians who are very good and nice, who never attack anybody, who never colonize anybody, as we discussed earlier. Another very famous and popular argument done by the Russian side is that the war, as any other conflict in which Russia took part, was made by the West. Russian state propaganda, with its media and representatives, talks about anything that happens that is the fault of the West. Russia attacked Ukraine, the West. Russia attacks Georgia. Guess whose fault it is? The West, the collective West. Just like with Ukraine today, Russian officials were talking a lot about NATO's importance in the conflict. We all know the plot. NATO is coming closer to the east, to the Russian borders, and Russia has to protect itself because it's the safety matter. That's why any means are necessary. According to the research done by independent Levada Center in Russia, right after this Russo-Georgian war, 66% of respondents, when asked the question why the Western establishment supported Georgia, chose an option because they try to weaken Russia and squeeze it out from Transcaucasia. At the same time, 49% of respondents of the same research believes that the main reason of the conflict is that the leadership of the US aims at spreading this influence on the countries neighboring to Russia. Is that true? In 2006, the Georgian parliament indeed voted for NATO integration. And right before the war in 2008, Georgia voted in a national referendum for integration for NATO, with more than 70% of population saying yes to the integration. But why would they do that? I mean, is that some sort of Western propaganda play? It depends on your point of view. Georgia is actually quite an ancient country, but in fact, it was a part of the Russian Empire for several centuries, and then it was the part of the Soviet Union. So its relationship with Russia are quite complicated. In academic community, it's a big discussion whether we can count post-Soviet republics, and Georgia specifically, as post-colonial republics. And if you're interested in the matter, you can read, for example, Madina Tlastanova. But overall, many Georgians, especially the younger population, don't like Russia so much. They point out many conflicts, the problematic language policy that happened during the Soviet Union. They talk about the cultural invasion. So they actually would like some protection from Russia. And the common counterpart to where the ex-Soviet bloc countries go is NATO. But the actual question is, was NATO ready to let them in? In fact, not yet. Georgia, just like Ukraine before the war, was not given any specific dates or was given any specific promises on when and how they are going to enter NATO. The alliance expects the countries to adjust their policies, become less corrupt, solve its territorial matters. And yes, for Georgia, it was even before the war because there was the independence of those republics. And they also expect those countries to solve the human rights problems. So, no, Georgia and Ukraine, both countries, were not actually invited to join NATO or anything. Georgia was actually complaining a lot because they were actively trying to enter, but NATO was not accepting them so readily because some countries like Germany were objecting to taking them in. So I personally don't believe that this argument stands to the point, because those countries, Georgia, didn't have any clear perspective on when it was going to enter, but still it was attacked, still it was accused of it all the time. So I don't think this argument is valid, but it's up to you to decide. Another quite common argument is that Russia was trying to save its citizens. But how did Russian citizens end up on Georgian territory? It is true that by the moment of invasion, the majority of Abkhaz and Ossetian population had Russian passports and Russian documents. They were also using Russian currency, ruble, as their exchange currency inside the country. But how did that happen? How did they have Russian documents and not the Georgian ones if those two republics are the part of Georgia? You see, after the Soviet Union fell and those wars in the 90s that we talked about, the majority of Abkhaz and Ossetian population actually didn't want to get Georgian documents, despite many attempts done by the Georgian side. The Abkhaz population could not go out of the country or could not use any foreign services because they only had the Soviet documents or their own independent Abkhaz and Ossetian passports. It was until 2002 when Russia introduced a law that allowed anyone who held previously the Soviet citizenship and still didn't get the other citizenship and didn't renew their documents for the new country to get a Russian citizenship. That's why, by 2008, around 80% of Abkhaz population, for example, got Russian passports. It opened the borders for them, helped them to use external services, and more importantly, Russian retirement pensions are higher than Georgians. So for Abkhaz and Ossetian people, it was even economically more beneficial. So many people went for this option. And because of this, we come to this interesting loop in the international law. In fact, if your population, people with your passports, are living in another country in the same region, can you protect their rights? For example, there are some parts of France where there are a lot of German citizens, especially not so far from the border. If France starts to discriminate against them, can Germany object? Most likely. But can Mexico, for example, tax taxes if Mexican citizens are not treated well there? It's actually problematic. International law does not give you any clear answer to that. So technically, yes, Russia was protecting the Russian citizens. It was using this gray zone of the international law for its benefit. The excuse of protecting the citizens in those specific regions does not work, in my opinion. Why? Because Russia actually went way beyond those territories. Russia occupied Gori, one of the important cities in Georgia that stays 85 kilometers away from the capital, for 2 weeks, even after the official proclamation of ceasefire. Russia also occupied one of the important ports of Georgia, Poti. And also, Russia was constantly bombing Tbilisi, the capital, which is not the place where Russian population lives. Bombing and also hostile actions of the Russian army led to approximately 200 deaths of the civilian population of Georgia. This argument does not necessarily work because Russia went way above those areas where the Russian population lives. So Russia cannot actually use only this argument. Probably the most popular argument that there is that if you talk with Russians, they'll tell you that they started it. By they, of course, it's Georgia. Who started the war of 2008? According to the EU independent fact-finding mission report from 2008, Georgia indeed made the first shot. But this shot was done after numerous provocations by the Russian side, Paz and Sedia side, and even in report itself, they claim that this shot cannot be called the beginning of the war because of the whole history before this. This first shot was a culmination of it. I don't believe we can attribute the responsibility to the everything that happened after only to this first attack of Georgia, although it will explain, and it does explain, the parts of the actions of the Russian Federation in this part of Georgia. It does not explain everything we have just said, those actions of Russia in the mainland Georgian territory. The question of responsibility on the war and the question of who started the war are absolutely related, but they are not equal. They are not the same. The responsibility of the war, of invading another country, of only alienating it, of putting your currency into it, of getting the citizens of this country becoming yours, is a very complicated matter. So I wouldn't reduce this whole big thing to just one first attack, although Georgia, of course, holds the responsibility of attacking Tsin Valley on the night between the 7th and the 8th of August in 2008. The last but my favorite argument that we have is that Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, is crazy. During and after the war, the Russian TVs were showing this footage of Saakashvili chewing his tie, and they were trying to present him as this crazy person who is a useless president and who is losing his country and also is trying to cling to the power. In this research done by Levada Center that I have already quoted, the 38% of respondents explained the Georgian use of power by Saakashvili's attempt to stay in power as a president. Later, when Saakashvili was working in Ukraine, it was shown as a part of this crazy Ukrainian policy that Ukraine is coming crazy. They are hiring this useless loser who was doing this war in Georgia. Later, when he lost his citizenship in Ukraine, it was also shown as a sort of his loser story, his journey. So it's all is a quite typical thing, because if you look right now, for example, at what Russian news and media say about Zelensky, you will see that he is represented as a crazy, blood-loving, drug-addicted person. So this is a very common argument. I believe many countries actually have this. They present their opponent as a crazy person who you can't trust. So Russia is not alone in that, but Russia loves using this argument for sure. Why does Russia do this specifically with Saakashvili? Because actually Saakashvili is a very interesting figure, and the feelings about him, even in Georgia, are quite mixed. So those arguments are actually used even for Russian-speaking Georgian population, which is, because of this Soviet language policy, a quite big part of it. Right now, if you look at anything related to Georgia, there is a very big process about Saakashvili. He is very ill, he's in the hospital, and they are trying to understand whether they need to imprison him or is he innocent. And it's a very big dispute inside the Georgian society. Because in fact, there are many people who still like Saakashvili. He was the leader of the Rose Revolution. He was trying to reform the country, and in some ways he was reforming it quite successfully. But at the same time, people are saying that during his office, there were a lot of problems with human rights. And of course, one of the main things during his office, the war happened. This is a thing that no people can forget. So the feelings about Saakashvili are quite mixed. So probably Russian propaganda is trying to polarize the society in this way. But for Russians, it is actually a normal thing to think that Saakashvili is crazy. But in fact, he's not. He's quite a successful reformator. He was invited to Ukraine because he actually knows what he was doing. And if you read about the results of his office, you will see that he is actually quite an interesting figure in the history of post-Soviet republics. So the claims that he's crazy are far from true. He's an interesting and a quite unique person, but he's far from being crazy. And this is just one of those arguments used a lot by the Russian propaganda. So let's jump to the conclusion because those were the most common arguments that Russian discourse has against Georgia. The War of 2008 actually became one of the main steps for Russia to become what it is right now. Human rights problems and feelings that the president can do whatever he wants was formed in many ways in this period. A very weak reaction from the West, which consisted of some very small sanctions that actually didn't affect the Russian economy much, that made many Russians believe that this was an okay action. If we go back to this Levada Research Center and check in their research, you can see that 47% of the respondents thought that the conflict would not affect the relations with the West. And well, if you think about this, they were right. After the war in 2008, Russia was free in doing whatever it wanted. The president at the time, Dmitry Medvedev, was discussing getting visa-free entrance for Russians in the Schengen zone. And people were thinking that Russia is this innovative country that is trying to promote science, which in a way is true. And for many Russians, of course, seeing how the country is attacking another country, it was the first step to accepting that this is a normal thing. Many Russians still try to live like this. They think that whatever happens outside of Russia actually will not affect them anyhow, even after 2 years after the beginning of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Understanding Russian behavior in this war and the discourse around it does not just help us to understand the patterns of the Russian propaganda, but it also shows that even if Russia gets the territories to itself, it will not stop right there. Like it didn't stop after Georgia and like it didn't stop after Crimea. If you came to this part of the video, thank you so much for watching it. I know I can be quite boring, so congratulations for your patience here. Please, if you find this video interesting, put a like, or if you didn't, write a comment of why not. I actually read all of them and I'm very interested in your opinion. Okay, see you next time. And again, as always, don't listen to the propaganda, stay away from dictatorships, and in general, take care of yourself. Bye.